Durango, Mexico, September 1969. The desert air shimmered with heat, the horizon blurring into a pale ribbon of light as the sun climbed high over the dusty hills outside the town. Wooden wagons, camera rigs, and clusters of crew members dotted the wide set like scattered islands in a sea of sand. Horses shifted restlessly near the corrals, their shadows long and dark across the ground. This was the filming location for The Undefeated, a large-scale Western production bringing together some of Hollywood's biggest names. Among them stood two men whose reputations were already legend. One was John Wayne, known to nearly everyone simply as the Duke. At 62, Wayne carried himself with a slow confidence that came from decades of commanding movie screens. His towering frame, deep voice, and unmistakable presence had defined the American Western for generations. The other was Burt Lancaster, the athletic, intensely driven performer who had built his career on powerful, dramatic roles. Lancaster had the body of an athlete and the mind of a perfectionist. He approached acting like a craft that demanded discipline, technique, and constant reinvention. Two giants of cinema, two completely different philosophies about what it meant to be a star. And on this desert set, their paths were about to collide in ways that no one present would ever forget. A tension beneath the surface. When Lancaster first arrived on location weeks earlier, the mood on the set had been optimistic. The film promised sweeping action scenes, cavalry charges, and the kind of rugged storytelling that audiences loved. But even on the first day, the difference between the two leading men was impossible to ignore. Wayne was relaxed, joking easily with the crew, greeting the horse wranglers and camera operators by name. He treated the set like familiar territory, a place where he had spent most of his adult life. Lancaster, on the other hand, moved through the production with focused intensity. He studied scripts carefully, discussed character motivations with the director, and frequently suggested subtle adjustments to dialogue and pacing. Neither approach was wrong, but they were worlds apart. To Lancaster, acting was a serious art form. To Wayne, acting was about instinct, presence, and authenticity. For the first few days, the difference remained nothing more than an interesting contrast. Then the small comments began. The first signs. During one rehearsal inside a dusty wooden barn built for a scene, Lancaster quietly approached the director with a suggestion. Maybe the character would hesitate here, he said thoughtfully, pointing to a line in the script. It might add psychological weight if we slow the moment. The director nodded, considering the idea. Across the room, Wayne listened silently. When the discussion ended, Wayne leaned back against a support beam and spoke with a casual smile. Sometimes, he said, a man just says what he means and gets on with it. The room fell quiet. It wasn't an insult, not exactly. But the meaning was clear. Lancaster said nothing. Yet from that moment on, something subtle changed between them. Two different worlds. The contrast between the men reflected two very different paths through Hollywood. Wayne's career had grown out of the classic studio system. His breakthrough in Stagecoach had launched him into stardom, and over the decades, he became the symbol of the American Western hero. His strength on screen came from simplicity. He didn't overanalyze scenes or dissect emotions. He simply embodied the character. Lancaster's journey had been different. Before entering film, he had worked as an acrobat, performing daring stunts in traveling shows. That physical discipline shaped his approach to acting. Every movement, every expression carried deliberate intention. His performances in films like From Here to Eternity and Elmer Gantry had earned him critical acclaim and an Academy Award. He believed deeply in craft. And in the quiet corners of the Durango set, he sometimes questioned whether Wayne relied too heavily on reputation rather than technique. The crew watches. Film crews notice everything. Camera operators, makeup artists, stunt coordinators. They had seen enough productions to recognize tension when it began forming. A grip named Carlos later remembered the atmosphere. At first it was just different styles, he would say years later. But after a while, you could feel the air change when they were in the same scene. Wayne remained calm and professional. Lancaster remained focused and determined. But small moments began accumulating. A line delivered slightly differently than rehearsed. A pause where none had been planned. A quiet correction offered during script discussions. None of these moments caused open conflict. Yet each one added another invisible layer to the growing tension. Rock Hudson notices. Their co-star, Rock Hudson, observed the situation with concern. Hudson had worked with many powerful personalities during his career and understood how fragile a film set's balance could be. One afternoon, while sitting under a shade tent between takes, he spoke privately with Lancaster. "You know, Duke has his own rhythm," Hudson said carefully. "He doesn't like too much analysis." Lancaster smiled slightly. "I'm not analyzing him," Lancaster replied. "I'm just trying to make the scene stronger." Hudson nodded, but he wasn't entirely convinced. Because the tension was no longer invisible. It had begun spreading quietly across the set. The lunch table moment. The turning point came during a long midday break. The cast gathered around folding tables near the edge of the set. Plates of food rested beside scripts, and conversations drifted between jokes, production delays, and upcoming scenes. Wayne sat with several crew members, laughing at a story about an earlier Western shoot. Lancaster approached the table. He placed his script down and spoke with calm directness. "Duke," he said. Wayne looked up. Lancaster continued, his tone measured but unmistakably firm. "I've been thinking about our last scene. Maybe there's a way to give the character a little more complexity." A few nearby crew members stopped talking. Wayne leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said slowly, "sometimes a character's strength is that he doesn't need complexity." The words hung in the air. Lancaster held Wayne's gaze. Neither man raised his voice. But the room felt suddenly very small. Respect and pride. Both men believed deeply in their craft. Both had spent decades earning their place in Hollywood. And both carried enormous pride. Wayne believed respect came from experience and presence. Lancaster believed respect came from skill and preparation. Neither philosophy left much room for compromise. As the crew returned to work that afternoon, the tension followed them. Camera operators adjusted lenses. The director reviewed shot lists. Actors took their marks. But everyone sensed that something important was building, something larger than a simple disagreement about acting styles. Two powerful personalities had reached the point where neither wanted to step back. And in the quiet desert heat of Durango, the moment that would test both men was approaching. The sun rose early over Durango, painting the Mexican desert in layers of pale gold and dusty orange. On the morning after the tense lunch conversation, the crew of the Undefeated returned to work knowing that something on the set had changed. The tension that had once been subtle now lingered openly in the air, like heat shimmering above the sand. It was the kind of atmosphere that experienced film crews immediately recognized. When two major stars disagreed, it was never just about dialogue or acting style. It became a matter of pride, reputation, and the delicate balance that held a production together. For John Wayne, the film set had always been a place where leadership came naturally. Over decades in Hollywood, he had developed a quiet authority that did not rely on shouting or theatrics. Directors trusted him to deliver scenes efficiently, crew members appreciated his straightforward professionalism, and younger actors often looked to him as a mentor. Wayne had spent his life embodying the strong, dependable characters audiences loved in Western films. Off-screen, he behaved much the same way. He believed a film set worked best when everyone respected their role and trusted the experience of those who had already proven themselves. Burt Lancaster came from a different tradition entirely. His early years as an acrobat had taught him that every performance required discipline, preparation, and physical commitment. Later, as his acting career flourished, he became known for approaching roles with intellectual curiosity. Lancaster enjoyed discussing motivations, exploring emotional layers, and refining dialogue until every line felt purposeful. To him, filmmaking was a collaborative art where actors constantly shaped their characters through discussion and experimentation. Neither philosophy was wrong. In fact, both approaches had produced extraordinary performances throughout Hollywood history. Yet when placed side by side on the same production, the contrast between them became impossible to ignore. Wayne preferred instinct and simplicity. Lancaster valued technique and exploration. What might have been an interesting creative dynamic slowly began transforming into something more complicated. During rehearsals, the difference became increasingly visible. Lancaster often asked questions about scenes, suggesting alternative readings of certain lines or proposing subtle changes to pacing. Directors sometimes appreciated these insights because they brought new depth to the characters. Wayne, however, rarely believed scenes required such detailed examination. He felt that overthinking dialogue could drain the natural rhythm from a moment. Instead, he preferred to step in front of the camera and let his instincts guide him. The crew noticed these moments immediately. When Lancaster paused during rehearsal to discuss character motivation, Wayne would usually stand quietly nearby, arms folded, waiting patiently. His silence was never openly hostile, but it carried an unmistakable message. He preferred action to discussion. For many actors, that approach felt refreshing. For Lancaster, it occasionally seemed dismissive. Despite the tension, the production continued moving forward. Long days were spent filming cavalry scenes across dusty hillsides, while dozens of horses thundered through carefully choreographed charges. The camera crews worked tirelessly to capture sweeping images of riders crossing the desert landscape, while stunt coordinators ensured every dangerous movement happened safely. In these moments, when the scale of the production demanded total concentration, personal disagreements faded into the background. Everyone was focused on making the film succeed. Still, the quiet rivalry between the two stars remained. One evening after filming wrapped for the day, several cast members gathered near a temporary fire pit outside the production camp. The desert air cooled quickly after sunset, and the flickering firelight cast long shadows across the sand. Conversations drifted between stories of past film sets, memories of Hollywood premieres, and the challenges of working far from home. Among those present was Rock Hudson, whose friendly personality made him something of a bridge between the different personalities on set. Hudson admired both Wayne and Lancaster and understood that each represented a different era of filmmaking. While Wayne symbolized the traditional Hollywood hero, Lancaster embodied the evolving world of dramatic storytelling. As the conversation continued, Hudson quietly observed the two men sitting across from each other near the fire. Wayne leaned comfortably in his chair, speaking with relaxed confidence about earlier Western films he had made during the 1940s and 1950s. Lancaster listened carefully, occasionally smiling, but his eyes revealed the restless focus that had always defined him. He admired Wayne's legacy, yet part of him believed that modern audiences demanded something deeper from their characters. Their exchange that evening remained polite, but the underlying difference between them became clearer with every passing minute. Wayne spoke about the importance of authenticity, about portraying characters who felt real because they reflected the values of strength, loyalty, and courage. Lancaster spoke about complexity, about exploring the internal struggles that shaped a character's decisions. Both perspectives carried wisdom, yet neither man seemed entirely convinced by the other's viewpoint. In the days that followed, the director began noticing subtle shifts during filming. Scenes that required both actors to share the frame occasionally took longer to complete. Lancaster might request an additional rehearsal to refine a gesture or adjust a line reading. Wayne would patiently wait, but when the cameras finally rolled, he often delivered the scene exactly as he originally intended. The result was a fascinating contrast between two styles of performance unfolding within the same moment. Some crew members found the dynamic exciting. They believed the tension between the actors might actually enhance the film, adding genuine energy to their interactions on screen. Others worried that if the disagreement continued growing, it could disrupt the entire production. Film sets relied on cooperation, and when two powerful personalities clashed, even the most experienced directors struggled to maintain harmony. One afternoon, while preparing for a scene involving a long dialogue exchange between the characters, the director gathered both actors to review the blocking. Lancaster suggested that a pause midway through the conversation could heighten the emotional impact. Wayne listened quietly, then nodded slowly. "That might work," Wayne said calmly, "but sometimes a man just says what he means and keeps moving." His voice remained friendly, yet the remark carried unmistakable weight. It was not a criticism, but it reaffirmed his belief that simplicity often conveyed more truth than elaborate analysis. Lancaster understood the implication immediately. He responded with equal calm, explaining that pauses could reveal what a character was thinking beneath the surface. The director eventually found a compromise, blending elements of both approaches. Moments like this repeated throughout the week. Each discussion remained respectful, yet the creative tension between them gradually intensified. Neither man intended to provoke conflict. They were simply defending the philosophies that had shaped their entire careers. What made the situation remarkable was that both actors, despite their differences, shared a deep respect for the craft of filmmaking. Wayne respected dedication and hard work, qualities Lancaster clearly possessed. Lancaster admired Wayne's ability to command a scene with seemingly effortless presence. Yet pride sometimes made it difficult for either man to openly acknowledge the strengths of the other. As the production moved closer to completing its most important scenes, the director hoped that time would ease the tension. Often, he believed, actors eventually discovered a rhythm that allowed different styles to coexist. But the desert environment, the long working hours, and the constant pressure of filming had a way of amplifying emotions. On a particularly hot afternoon, as the cast prepared for another sequence near a wooden fence built for the set, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. Crew members moved quietly between equipment, adjusting lighting reflectors and checking camera angles. The horses stamped impatiently in the background while assistant directors organized the next shot. Wayne stood near his chair reviewing the day's script pages. Lancaster approached from across the set, his expression thoughtful. The two men exchanged brief greetings before discussing the upcoming scene. Their conversation remained polite, yet several nearby crew members sensed the familiar undercurrent of disagreement. It was not anger nor hostility. It was something deeper. Two legendary actors determined to prove that their understanding of performance was the one that truly captured the spirit of the story. As the cameras prepared to roll and the director called everyone into position, no one on the set could yet imagine how significant this creative rivalry would become in the years ahead. What they were witnessing was more than a disagreement between colleagues. It was a collision between two eras of Hollywood, two philosophies of storytelling, and two men whose legacies would forever shape the history of cinema. And though the confrontation that people would later talk about had not yet occurred, the foundation for that moment had already been laid. Every discussion, every pause during rehearsal, every quiet disagreement added another layer to the growing tension. The desert wind swept gently across the set as the cameras began recording once again. Neither man realized that their rivalry, born from pride, passion, and two different visions of acting, was slowly becoming one of the most talked-about stories in Hollywood lore. The Durango desert had a strange way of magnifying emotions. Day after day, the production of the Undefeated unfolded beneath a relentless sky, where the sun burned away patience as easily as it burned away the morning mist. By the time the third week of filming arrived, the quiet rivalry between John Wayne and Burt Lancaster had become impossible for anyone on set to ignore. It was not open hostility. Neither man raised his voice or behaved unprofessionally. Yet every conversation between them carried a tension that even the newest crew member could feel. What made the situation unusual was that both actors remained deeply committed to the film. Despite their philosophical differences about acting, they arrived on set early each morning, fully prepared for their scenes. Wayne continued to work with the steady confidence that had defined his career for decades, delivering performances that required very little rehearsal. Lancaster maintained his methodical discipline, reviewing lines carefully and discussing character motivations with the director whenever possible. To an outside observer, it might have looked like two craftsmen simply approaching their work in different ways. But inside the production, the contrast between them created a kind of quiet electricity. Crew members began speaking about it in hushed conversations near the equipment trucks, or inside the shade tents where they escaped the afternoon heat. They admired both men, yet many wondered how long the delicate balance could last. The film depended heavily on scenes where their characters shared the screen, and every one of those scenes required a careful blend of timing and emotional rhythm. When actors disagreed about how a moment should unfold, even the most experienced director had to navigate the situation with caution. One particular afternoon became a turning point. The production schedule called for filming a long dialogue scene near a weathered wooden fence that had been constructed as part of the set. The scene itself was meant to portray a tense conversation between two military leaders whose mutual respect was complicated by differences in temperament. In many ways, the fictional exchange mirrored the real relationship developing between Wayne and Lancaster. The director gathered the actors and walked them through the sequence. Lancaster listened carefully and then offered a suggestion about the pacing of one line. He believed that if his character paused briefly before responding, it would reveal uncertainty beneath the surface confidence. The idea was thoughtful and consistent with Lancaster's approach to performance. Wayne considered the suggestion for a moment. He leaned against the fence rail, glancing across the dusty set where crew members waited quietly for the rehearsal to continue. Finally, he spoke in his familiar low voice. "Sometimes a man doesn't hesitate," Wayne said calmly. "Sometimes he already knows what he's going to say." His comment was delivered without anger, yet the difference between their perspectives was clear once again. Lancaster nodded thoughtfully, but he did not entirely withdraw his idea. The director eventually adjusted the scene so that both interpretations could coexist within the dialogue. Rehearsal resumed, and the cameras began recording. The scene turned out remarkably strong. On screen, the contrast between the two actors created a natural tension that enhanced the drama of the moment. Wayne's steady authority balanced Lancaster's more analytical presence, giving the conversation a layered complexity that audiences would later find compelling. Yet even as the director praised the performance, the underlying rivalry remained. Later that evening, as the crew packed away equipment and prepared for the following day's shoot, several actors gathered near the production camp. The desert sky had turned deep violet, and a cool breeze moved across the open landscape. It was the kind of quiet evening that usually allowed everyone to relax after long hours of filming. Rock Hudson joined the group and began telling stories about earlier projects he had worked on in California. His warm personality helped lighten the mood, and soon laughter drifted across the camp. Wayne listened with a relaxed smile, occasionally adding a humorous remark of his own. Lancaster sat nearby, thoughtful as always, occasionally contributing to the conversation with observations about the evolution of film storytelling. At one point, Hudson turned toward Lancaster and asked what had drawn him to the project in the first place. Lancaster answered honestly. He explained that he admired stories exploring leadership and responsibility, especially when characters faced difficult choices. Western films, he said, offered a unique way to examine those themes because they placed individuals in situations where moral decisions carried immediate consequences. Wayne nodded slowly. "That's one way to look at it," he said. Then he added something that revealed his own philosophy. "Sometimes the story is simpler than that. Sometimes it's just about people doing what needs to be done." The exchange remained friendly, but it illustrated once again how differently the two men viewed storytelling. In the days that followed, the production moved into its most demanding phase. Large action scenes required coordination between dozens of writers, stunt performers, and camera crews. Horses galloped across open fields while cannons fired in the background, creating dramatic images that would eventually become highlights of the film. During these intense sequences, the earlier disagreement seemed less important. Both actors worked tirelessly, performing difficult writing scenes and long hours under the hot sun. Wayne's experience with Western productions proved invaluable, as he helped guide younger performers through complicated stunt choreography. Lancaster's athletic background allowed him to perform many of his own physical actions, earning admiration from the stunt team. Yet despite these moments of cooperation, the philosophical divide between them never fully disappeared. One afternoon, while reviewing footage from earlier scenes, the director invited both actors to watch a playback. The film reel flickered inside the small projection tent, illuminating their faces as the previous day's performance appeared on screen. The scene showed the two characters speaking quietly before an upcoming battle. Lancaster studied the image carefully. "I think there's a moment where the character could show more hesitation," he said thoughtfully. "Just a small gesture, maybe." Wayne watched the same footage with calm focus. "I think the moment works fine," he replied. "Sometimes the audience understands more than we give them credit for." The director listened to both perspectives before deciding that the scene already carried the emotional weight it needed. Neither actor argued further, but once again the conversation revealed how differently they approached their craft. What no one on the set realized at the time was that these discussions, respectful as they were slowly shaping a story that would later circulate throughout Hollywood for decades. The tension between two legendary performers had become part of the film's history long before the cameras stopped rolling. By the time the production entered its final weeks, most of the major scenes had already been completed. The remaining schedule involved smaller dialogue moments and additional action shots that would tie the story together. Spirits among the crew improved as everyone sensed the finish line approaching. On one particular morning, the cast gathered again near the wooden fence set where earlier rehearsals had taken place. The director explained that the scene required the characters to stand face to face while discussing their opposing strategies. It was a moment built entirely on dialogue and presence. Wayne stepped into position with his usual steady confidence. Lancaster joined him a few seconds later, script pages folded neatly in his hand. For a brief moment, the two men looked at each other across the dusty ground, their expressions calm but focused. Neither spoke, yet everyone nearby sensed that the long weeks of creative tension had reached a quiet climax. The cameras began to roll, and in that silent moment before the first line was delivered, the crew realized they were witnessing something rare. Not simply two actors performing a scene, but two towering figures of Hollywood history confronting the fundamental question of what made a performance powerful. Was it instinct? Was it technique? Or was it something deeper that emerged only when two strong personalities met face to face beneath the unforgiving light of the desert sun? The answer would not come through conflict or spectacle. Instead, it would reveal itself through the quiet professionalism both men ultimately chose to maintain. Their rivalry never erupted into the dramatic confrontation that rumors later exaggerated. Instead, it remained a powerful creative tension that shaped the performances audiences would eventually see on screen. As the director called "cut" and the scene ended, Wayne tipped his hat slightly toward Lancaster in a gesture of mutual respect. Lancaster returned the nod. In that simple exchange, both men acknowledged something important. They might never agree about how acting should be approached, but each recognized the dedication and strength the other brought to the craft. And sometimes, in Hollywood as in life, respect grows not from winning an argument, but from standing your ground with dignity while allowing another master to do the same. By the final weeks of filming for the Undefeated, the Durango set had begun to feel like a small frontier town that had existed for months rather than weeks. The wooden buildings constructed for the film stood weathered by dust and sunlight, while the long cavalry tracks carved into the desert floor told the story of countless scenes already captured on camera. For the crew and actors who had lived and worked there through long, exhausting days, the place had become more than just a film location. It was a temporary world where personalities, ideas, and ambitions had collided under the relentless Mexican sun. At the center of that world remained the two men whose presence defined the production, John Wayne and Burt Lancaster. By this stage in filming, the rivalry that had quietly grown between them had settled into something calmer, almost reflective. It was no longer fueled by disagreement or tension, but by a kind of unspoken recognition that both men were masters of their craft, shaped by different paths, but united by the same dedication to storytelling. The transformation did not happen overnight. It emerged slowly as the production moved toward completion. Each actor had spent weeks observing the other's approach, noticing details that might have been invisible at the beginning. Lancaster began to appreciate the remarkable efficiency with which Wayne performed. There was a clarity to Wayne's acting that required no elaborate preparation. He stepped into a scene with confidence, spoke his lines with conviction, and created a presence that filled the frame. Decades of experience had taught him exactly how much effort was necessary, and exactly when restraint made a moment stronger. Wayne, in turn, quietly acknowledged Lancaster's commitment to exploring every nuance of his character. Watching Lancaster rehearse scenes revealed how carefully he considered each gesture and expression. Lancaster did not simply deliver dialogue, he constructed emotional layers beneath every line. Wayne understood that such dedication came from a deep respect for the audience and the story being told. Although neither man openly admitted these realizations, The change was visible in their interactions. Conversations that once carried tension gradually became more relaxed. When Lancaster suggested a small adjustment to a scene during rehearsal, Wayne no longer responded with skepticism, but with thoughtful curiosity. When Wayne proposed simplifying a moment that felt overly complicated, Lancaster considered the idea with genuine interest. The crew noticed the difference immediately. What had once been an atmosphere of creative friction had evolved into something far more productive. The director, relieved by the shift, began allowing both actors greater freedom to shape their performances. The results were striking. Scenes between Wayne and Lancaster gained an authenticity that could not have been scripted. Their characters appeared to challenge each other with genuine conviction because the actors themselves understood the perspectives they represented. One evening, after a particularly successful day of filming, several members of the cast gathered once again near the edge of the production camp. The desert night was unusually clear, and thousands of stars stretched across the sky like a silver river. A small fire burned in the center of the group, its light illuminating the faces of those who had spent weeks together in the remote landscape. Among them was Rock Hudson, who had quietly watched the evolution of the relationship between the two leading men. Hudson had always believed that great films often emerged from moments when powerful personalities challenged each other creatively. Now, as he looked across the fire toward Wayne and Lancaster talking together, he felt certain that the tension they had experienced earlier in the production had ultimately strengthened the film. The conversation that evening turned toward the future of Hollywood itself. The late 1960s marked a period of enormous change in the film industry. Younger directors and actors were beginning to experiment with new storytelling styles, while audiences demanded more complex characters and themes. Some wondered whether the traditional Western hero, the kind Wayne had embodied for decades, would continue to dominate the screen. Wayne listened to these discussions quietly before offering his perspective. He believed that while styles of filmmaking might change, the core elements of storytelling would remain the same. Audiences would always respond to courage, loyalty, and characters who faced difficult decisions with integrity. Those qualities, he believed, transcended any particular genre. Lancaster responded thoughtfully, suggesting that the evolving world of cinema allowed actors to explore deeper emotional landscapes. He believed the future of film would involve characters who revealed not only strength, but vulnerability and moral complexity. The remarkable thing about their exchange was that it no longer carried the tension of earlier weeks. Instead, it sounded like a thoughtful dialogue between two experienced artists sharing their visions of storytelling. The rivalry that once seemed capable of disrupting the production had transformed into mutual respect. In the days that followed, filming reached its final stages. The remaining scenes required careful coordination as the production team captured the closing moments of the story. Horses galloped across the desert once again, and the cameras recorded sweeping shots of riders disappearing into the horizon. Each completed scene brought the project closer to its conclusion. When the director finally announced that the final shot had been completed, a wave of relief spread across the entire set. Months of planning, preparation, and hard work had culminated in that moment. Crew members applauded while actors embraced each other in celebration. For many of them, the Durango production would remain one of the most memorable experiences of their careers. Wayne and Lancaster stood near the wooden fence where so many important scenes had been filmed. For a moment, they looked out across the empty desert, reflecting on everything that had unfolded there. Lancaster broke the silence first. He admitted that working on the film had challenged him in ways he had not expected. Observing Wayne's approach had reminded him that authenticity sometimes required simplicity rather than elaborate preparation. Wayne responded with equal honesty. Watching Lancaster work, he said, had shown him how dedication to character could uncover emotional layers that instinct alone might miss. The conversation ended with a handshake that symbolized the respect both men had ultimately earned from each other. It was not dramatic or ceremonial. It was simply the gesture of two professionals acknowledging that their differences had led to something meaningful. When the Undefeated was eventually released, audiences appreciated the powerful performances delivered by its cast. Critics noted the compelling dynamic between Wayne and Lancaster, observing how their contrasting styles created memorable moments throughout the film. What the public rarely understood was that the authenticity of those scenes had been shaped by weeks of creative tension and eventual mutual understanding. Years later, film historians would reflect on the production as an example of how artistic differences can ultimately strengthen a project. Instead of allowing rivalry to divide them, the two actors transformed their disagreement into a source of creative energy. Their willingness to stand firm in their beliefs while respecting each other's experience demonstrated a lesson that extended far beyond the world of cinema. The story of their collaboration remains one of Hollywood's most fascinating behind-the-scenes chapters. It reminds us that greatness rarely emerges from comfort alone. Sometimes it grows from moments when strong personalities challenge each other, forcing everyone involved to reach higher than they thought possible. And in the quiet desert where the film was made, the echoes of that creative struggle still seem to linger. Beneath the vast sky of Durango, two legends of Hollywood discovered that even the strongest rivalries can evolve into something greater, a shared legacy built on dedication, respect, and the timeless power of storytelling.